As long as we are able to think about things, we choose what we think about. Every second that we spend, and I mean that literally because consciousness is something that is given to us and does not last forever. It is something that is spent. Every second that we spend thinking about the relative health of the romantic relationships of the cast of Jersey Shore is a second that we choose to spend thinking about Snooki and or the situation. Every second that we choose to spend thinking about astrophysics, thinking about other people, thinking about ourselves, thinking about that boy who dumped us, that's a second that we choose to spend in the manner that we spend it. And I think that the challenge that we all face is to try to spend our consciousness in the best possible way, right? Like to try to orient it in the way that will be most fulfilling for us, most helpful for other people, whatever we're going to choose as our values, whatever we're going to choose as like the thing that matters most to us. That's going to orient what we choose to think about. And I wrote this novel with that in mind. My grandfather died a couple weeks ago. He was 92 years old, and when I was at his funeral, people said over and over again to me, your grandfather lived a long, rich, full life, which is very true, but he also lived to be 92, and so he had an opportunity to live a long, rich, full life. And that's sort of two models of okay death in our world today. There's that model. You live to be 92, you have a long, good, full life, and then at your funeral everybody gets to say how long and good and full your life was. And then there's the model of the heroic sacrifice, right? The story of contemporary heroism, which is generally involves like jumping on a grenade to save your buddies and or your country or whatever. There has to be some kind of like noble sacrifice, and usually you miraculously survive this noble sacrifice. I'm not criticizing my friends in the audience in Hollywood. I'm just making an observation. So, this goes back a long way. We didn't invent this idea. First-person shooter video games didn't invent this idea. I wrote that scene partly because I wanted to get at something important about the difference between Augustus and Hazel. Hazel gives Augustus, or doesn't give it to him, but tells him about her favorite book, An Imperial Affliction, which is this novel about a young woman who has cancer and her attempt to live a minorly heroic life. A kind of small heroism. And Augustus gives Hazel this book in which Staff Sergeant Max Mayhem kills 102 people in 221 pages. It's a very enjoyable book. It's nicely written in the manner of novelizations, but it is not, it portrays its own kind of heroism. And that kind of heroism goes way back. I didn't invent this. First-person shooter video games didn't invent this. Augustus Waters certainly didn't invent it. You know, if you go all the way back to the Odyssey, which I'm about to ruin for those of you who haven't read it, so sorry. A, you've had ample opportunity. B, it's still good even if you know how it's going to end. There's this dude, and he does some fighting in a war. He's really good warring. And at the end of his good warring, he comes home, but it takes a while. I love you when I have readers who will like cheer for my summaries of the author. So he gets home, and there are all these guys hanging out at his house, trying to get with his wife. And to be fair, I mean, this was thousands of years ago. There was no text messaging. Like, she had no way of knowing that he was fine, that he was just taking his sweet time coming home. And neither did the suitors. They all rightly assumed that, you know, he was probably dead. And so he shows up, and the correct response in this situation is to be like, hey, I'm here now, y'all should leave. But instead, the floors of the palace course with blood, and he kills like 110 of the suitors, plus some young ladies, although in view of their behavior, one uses the term loosely. And that's your happily ever after ending. That's your model of heroism. Guy comes home after a heroic journey and slaughters a bunch of people, including some women who, it's crazy. And you know, there's another popular model of the short heroic life, or the heroic warring life, the heroic family political strife life that you see in, for instance, epics like Romeo and Juliet, where you have this big political problem that prevents you from getting with the girl that you like, so you kill yourself. and that's a bad decision. But that's held up as a kind of model of heroism in the epic stories that we have inherited. And just as the Staff Sergeant Max Mayhem and The Price of Dawn offer us a kind of heroic story that we've also inherited. I wanted to write a novel about a different kind of heroism. I wanted to write a smaller epic story about a star-crossed love story that was about, instead of being about war or politics or family strife or any of that stuff, was about the little thing that circumscribes almost all of our lives, which is disease. And I started wanting to write this story in 2000 when I worked very briefly for about 5 months as a student chaplain at a children's hospital. And it was very difficult work. I met a lot of kids who were dying and families. I was with a lot of families when their children died, and it was really tough. And for many years after that, I wrote and wrote and wrote about this. But everything that I wrote was self-indulgent and terrible, to be frank with you. Really, really bad. It all starred this ruggedly handsome 22-year-old hospital chaplain. I desperately wish I were kidding. It was like Grey's Anatomy with a hint of religion. Like, which eye doctor will he choose? And, you know, I would send it into my editor and she would say, there's some interesting stuff here, but the chaplain has got to go. And I'd be like, no, the chaplain is the center of it. I couldn't find a way to take myself out of the story because I was trying to process what had happened to me for me. I wasn't trying to make a gift for you. And that's ultimately what a novel has to be. And I don't think I ever would have gotten there. I don't think I ever would have gotten past that place of writing this self-indulgent, terrible story about a hot 22-year-old hospital champ. If it hadn't been for meeting my friend Esther in 2008. And when I met Esther, who was a young woman who had cancer and died in 2010. But when I first met Esther, it was at LeakyCon, a Harry Potter conference. She was just extraordinarily charismatic and empathetic and able to be both funny and awkward at the same time in a way that teenagers are usually just the one. And I just kind of, like so many other people who knew Esther, just sort of fell under her spell. And it was a great privilege of my life to be friends with her, and a great sadness in my life that I have to spend the rest of my life mourning her. But I don't think that I ever could have written this story if I hadn't known Esther. I should say that Hazel and Esther are extremely different people. I should particularly say that because Esther is not here to defend herself against terrible accusations like that she would watch America's Next Top Model. But knowing Esther pulled me out of the story and allowed me to write it as a gift. The person I would most want to read the story isn't here, but I'm very, very grateful to all of you for being here and allowing me to share the story with you. And I'll repeat what Hank Sock said, which is that, what? He's a sock. Which is that our community has done a lot of projects with Esther while she was alive and also since her death, and that work continues today in the form of This Star Won't Go Out, which is a great organization set up by Esther's family, and y'all should really consider donating. Your donations up to $500 will be matched by us tonight. We've already raised almost $15,000 for This Star Won't Go Out on tour, so you have a lot to live up to.